Hey, welcome back. So in today's video, we are going to triumph over our house one more time with another DIY project. We're going to lay down some laminate floor in a relatively small room like this. But before we can get this stuff down, we obviously got to buy it, and that's a chore unto itself. So let's go do that first. And here we are, and there are an absolute buttload to choose from. Look at them all. Most of the laminate that you find are going to be between 8 and 12 mils. Some might be thinner, some might be thicker. Not very common though. However, some might say they have a 2mm attached pad on them like this guy, and that's nothing more than the fact that it's already got pre-installed underlay. Now again, that's not totally necessary. Mine didn't have it, just saves you a step later on. Now, you can see here the thickness difference between the 8 and the 12 mil flooring. Now, I usually like to stick at 12 mil, 10 mil at the thinnest. The reason being is it's much stronger when you walk on it. There's a lot less flex, as you can see here by this super scientific test that I ran in the store. Yeah, pretty impressed, aren't you? Now, while the 12 mil may be nicer to walk on, it also has the added benefit of being much girthier in the tongue and groove joint department here, as you can see. Now, because they're much thicker, they're going to be much less likely to split apart and open up and create a gap over time at all of your joints. With all that done, now we can go ahead and pick our flooring, the color, the species, all the little textural details and enhancements like this. But before you leave the store, make sure to grab one of these doohickeys on the way out the door because, well, you're going to need it to install the flooring later on. Then once you've got it home, let it sleep for a couple of days to let it acclimate. Now we're ready to start laying our flooring, and the first thing we got to do is check everything for level. If you have a big heave in the floor, you may want to sand it down first. If you have a dip in the floor, you may need to fill it with some self-leveling compound first. Mine is pretty good, so I just jumped straight into laying my underlayment down, and just like everything else, there's a bunch of different styles depending on where your flooring is going to be going in the house, depending on what it's going to be going over top of, so just get the stuff that's right for you. I just needed the 2mm thick basic foam for this, so it was pretty good because I'm just going over old linoleum. And yes, you can go over top of old linoleum as long as it's in pretty good shape. Now, usually you can just use a stapler like this or a hammer tacker, but this stuff's pretty old and it was bending my staples, so I resorted to just taping it down with tuck tape. Continuing along with the second row of underlayment, you will need to seam these together. Now, luckily enough, this stuff actually has a tape seam right at the very end of the roll, and it just kind of worked that way. I've never actually used this stuff before. It was kind of neat, but it's not a big deal. If yours doesn't have it, you need to seam them together. Again, just grab the tuck tape. Now we need to measure just the face of the floor plank itself, as well as the floor of the room, and figure out how many planks it's going to take to cover the entire thing. Basically what we're shooting for is to not have the last row be around 2 inches or less. We don't want that. If that's the case on yours, you may have to end up taking the very first row and ripping it down in width, and that'll effectively shift the entire floor over by a couple of inches to avoid that problem. Now, if you want to get real wild and crazy, you can make the first and the last row the exact same size, but again, it's not necessary. And finally, we can get onto the boards. So with some of the spacers from our kit taped up against the wall, we can prep the first row. Start by ripping the tongues off of the short and long side of the boards that are going to be up against the wall. Then loosely set the boards in place so we can measure for the last row. Now, instead of using a measuring tape here, we're going to spin the board around so it's actually backwards, and then mark it referencing the rest of the floorboards. This ensures you get a perfect fit every time. The only thing to watch out for is to make sure this is at least 6 inches or longer, and if it's not, cut a couple inches off the very first board to shift the whole thing over to the side. Now in this first row, I also had to make a cutout for my HVAC ducting in the floor, and I could just barely see it. And just like before, there's no point in trying to use a tape measure. Use the HVAC duct as a reference. It's a lot easier and more accurate that way. And now we can finally slide that glorious first row into place. Just make sure all your gaps are tight. Use them tap blocks if you need to. They came with your kit. Now from here on out, we want to be conscious of the pattern in the seams in our floor. We want it to be random. So with that in mind, I grabbed a full board and just cut it in a random spot close to the center. And that ended up being the starter for my next row. Now keep all of your scraps as you go along, because a lot of the times they're actually going to end up being a perfect board for either a starter or an end piece somewhere along the way. So just keep them around. Now while you're going along here, you'll notice I'm kind of lifting the boards up and down or sliding them left and right along the long sides. Now this is just so it helps slide them into place a little bit easier, so you don't have to beat the absolute hell out of them with the tapping block. Obviously hold the tapping block while you're using it as well. I was just trying not to shake the camera. Now every single joint will have to be closed using the tapping block or the pull bar regardless. Here I've set the long side in first and I pull it into the short side after tapping the joint tight. Now, when using these blocks, do not use them on the tongue and groove. If you break that, you will have to just throw that board out and get a new board. Use them off the side of the face. Now for the next row, I just set everything loosely into place and double checked the randomness of my joints and seams. And I noticed if I cut about 3 inches off of the very first board, it was going to be perfect. And the last board in the row was still long enough to cut down just a couple more inches and it would have been perfect too. And that one's actually the end piece of the second row starter strip that I just randomly cut before. And with this board here, I actually slid it into place short side first and then tapped it over into the long side. So don't be afraid to go either or, depending on what you're up against, if you're near something, if you only have limited room, whatever works. Now at this point I should also mention I've been grabbing random boards from random boxes the entire time, and that's just to negate the effects of any random color patterns or texture patterns from box to box. Now we've also hit our very first obstacle today, and that's this closet door. So we need to undercut it. Now you can either get a manual undercut saw or just use a powered oscillating saw like this. But use a scrap piece of your flooring to mark the height. That way if it ends up scratching, you didn't actually scratch a brand new plank. When it comes to making odd cuts like this, it's honestly easiest if you just square the board up with the rest of the flooring itself, double checking it with the tape measure. Once you've got it square, use the wall to reference as many marks as you can and then measure what you can't. After that, if you're still a little bit unsure about your cut, just cut inside the lines and cut it smaller. Remember, you can always take more off, but adding it back on, well, that's impossible. And you just have to basically cut the wasted piece off of that board and save the rest as a starter strip. You don't have to throw the whole thing out. But again, just better safe than sorry. Another little tip is to just keep an eye on your joints for little pieces of shrapnel like this that kind of tend to break off from time to time, because while it's small, it will stop a joint from closing tightly. And now we've come on to the second obstacle of the day, and that's, for me at least, the other half of this closet. But it doesn't matter if it's a doorway or a pony wall or whatever, something that intrudes into the room. Save yourself the hassle and make it in 2 pieces. As you can see here, I've got both pieces that kind of reach around the doorway itself, and they're kind of meeting in the middle. That way you can just slide the 2 pieces into each other, and it's just so much easier than trying to wrestle a single board into that. It's just nightmare fuel for you. Undercutting the main entry door is exactly the same process it was for the closet, just we have to undercut the trim as well as the door frame itself, and this is obviously just going to be a lot thicker and a little bit more work than it was that little piece for the closet. When it comes to measuring for the last row, I've got my next floor plank sitting exactly where it's going to be installed. I'm measuring ever so slightly off the wall to the face of the flooring itself and then transferring that measurement to my plank. I'm doing it at both ends, and this just helps ensure if the wall isn't square, my measurement is still perfect. Then when it comes to the door frame, I just slide it up to it, and you've got a lot of wiggle room here underneath the door frame itself. There's a lot of an air gap, so make sure you're about 3/4 of an inch to a 1/2 inch inside of the door frame, as well as still underneath the trim when you make your mark. Once you've got the boards cut and roughly slid into place, the whole last row will need to be tapped over and then pulled back towards the rest of the floor to get them slid and locked into joints. Now, I was using a pretty thick pull bar here. Once the flooring was in place, I had a good 1/4 inch gap, but I did have to tap the pry bar towards the wall first just to get it to slide in between the boards. Just be careful when you're doing all this tapping right next to the wall that you don't actually damage the wall at the same time. And then I hit the wall. Now the last step is the transition strip. Now there's different types of transition strips, so get the one that matches your flooring. In my case, just a T-mold was fine, but these are pretty universal, so just get the one that matches the correct wood species and the color as close as you can to your flooring. Now because my flooring was pretty thick, the metal tracking, if I was to just install it straight on the subfloor, was going to be too low for my transition strip to snap into. So I had to build it up with these 1/4 inch plywood strips that I ripped and glued and nailed in place. And now we can install the metal tracking that came with our transition strip. Now once it's screwed down into place, another good tip is to just bend it open ever so slightly. I'm just using a pair of pliers here, but I'm just opening it up. Now this is going to make it much less likely, if you ever have to pull this thing up, that it's going to rip and tear, because I've definitely done that before, even recently actually. But this little groove here is what actually snaps into it. Now you notice on the edges, I did have to trim them to fit around the door frame, but it's the same process as the rest of the flooring. Hold it in place, mark it with a pencil, and cut it. But if everything's done correctly, it should snap into place very easily, just like this. And the final step is to reinstall all of our baseboard. Now if you need to do that, you're in luck. I've got a video showing you how to do just that. But if you didn't remove your baseboard first and you installed your floor up to it, you're going to need some of this 1/4 round here. Just make sure you nail it into the baseboard itself that's already there and not the flooring. Well, I hope your guys' turned out as awesome as mine did. I'm super happy with the way it looks. But otherwise, that brings me to the end of this video. I hope you guys liked this. If you did, obviously a thumbs up and a subscription down below would be amazing. Don't if you didn't. Let me know what you guys think down below, and check out my plans as well if you guys want to build some furniture to put in your room after you're done. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye.